welcome back to Claims and Sustains. And if you've ever driven past a construction site and wondered, was that bulldozer made in America? This is the episode for you.
And it also means you've probably been listening to too much of our Buy American content.
Probably. Congratulations. I'm Amy Hoang.
I'm Sarah, and this is our 4th episode in our Buy American series. Today we're covering 5 things you have to know about the Build America, Buy America Act, or as we lovingly know it, BABA.
All right, let's get started. First note. BABA, or Build America, Buy America, is going to apply to federal grants, not federal contracts. Basic start, but very, very important. And if you're wondering, what's the difference? I have a contract, I have an agreement, I don't know what it is. Big picture, federally funded grants are going to be usually state and local projects that are funded with federal dollars. So think like a city bridge or railway terminal. Federal contracts, you're thinking more like a construction project for a specific agency where the federal government is the end user. So think, a VA medical center, for instance. And while it might be a little tricky a little down the line to be able to tell which one is which, look for terms like federally assisted, federal grant, 2 CFR Part 200 or 2 CFR Part 184. Those are going to be a good indication that you're dealing with a federal grant and not a federal contract. Why does it matter? Because BABA is only going to apply to federal grants. Federal contracts, you're going to be looking at the Buy American Act or the Trade Agreements Act, things you can learn about in our other Buy American series.
And I think that really kind of highlights the fact that it's not just as simple as knowing like, oh, I'm dealing with the federal government. Knowing how your funding source is categorized can also be can have a huge impact on what your compliance obligations are. So the second fun fact about BABA is that even if you have a grant, not all grants are covered by BABA. BABA specifically covers infrastructure grants or grants for infrastructure projects. And BABA defines infrastructure pretty broadly. So you're thinking structures and facilities and sometimes equipment for transit, energy, water systems, broadband, roads. So there's a lot of things that could fall under the purview of BABA. That being said, if you are dealing with a grant for a non-infrastructure project, so things like technical assistance or job training, you aren't going to be subject to those BABA requirements.
That's a really good point. Another thing to add to that is even if it's something that seems like it's an infrastructure project, just to make it a little more complicated, if it is an infrastructure project, but it's subject to Department of Transportation money that already has its own separate Buy America rules, you're going to have to look and see whether Buy America, DOT Buy America applies or whether BABA applies. And it can sometimes be a little tricky, and it's going to depend on which is the stricter regime. Mm-hmm. All right, so moving on to the third fun fact about BABA is even if you know that BABA applies to your federally funded infrastructure project, BABA is not necessarily going to apply to every single item on that infrastructure project. So good example, if you have construction equipment that you're using that's not actually going to be incorporated into the end infrastructure project, so bulldozers, scaffolding, those items are not subject to BABA's Buy American requirements. A good example is, think of it as the nail that you're putting in the project has to be BABA compliant, but the hammer you're using doesn't. Another thing to think about is actually what items are permanently affixed or incorporated into the project. So BABA's Buy American requirements are going to apply to items that are permanently affixed or incorporated into the project. And a way I like to think of it is, if I take my daughter's Bluey dollhouse here, and I just...
Built with federal infrastructure funds.
And I just shake it, right? The stuff that's still in here is probably going to be covered by BABA, but your chairs, your tables, the things that fall out, not going to be covered.
And I think that's probably a kind of sigh of relief for a lot of contractors when they're looking at these BABA requirements of how do I get, to your point, my bulldozer to be BABA compliant. So I think that can be a nice, yes, there are requirements, but not everything that you bring on site has to hit those standards.
Absolutely.
So our fourth fun fact is that BABA applies to different materials in different ways. And BABA carves out 3 significant categories of materials. The first being manufactured product, the second being construction material, so things like lumber and glass, and the third being predominantly iron and steel products, which are products that are more than 50% iron and steel by cost, and it treats them differently for compliance reasons. So in some ways it can be nice because if your product falls kind of squarely into one of those categories, BABA gives you some relatively straightforward guidance on what BABA compliance looks like. However, that's not always cut and dry. You have a lot of times where you're providing a product that's a combination of multiple things. So you've really got to be looking at how BABA has described the requirements and what exactly you're delivering to the government.
Yeah, and I think a common misconception is that things always will fall squarely into one of those categories. What we found is there's a lot of gray area. There's times where we're looking at something and we don't know whether something's a construction material or a manufactured product because it seems like it could fit into both. The nice thing about the regulations is it does confirm for you that you don't have to comply with 2 separate standards if you think that your product could be either a manufactured product or a construction material. The advice we usually give is if you're in kind of a gray area, if it's not clear, as long as you're documenting how you reach the determination and as long as you're remaining consistent with that determination, that's about the best you can do. All right, and then the final fun fact about BABA is that it is going to apply even if you're lower down in the supply chain. So for instance, if you're dealing with a federally funded grant, the grant recipient might be the state or the city that actually received the federal funds. Well, that doesn't mean that it's just the state or the city who has to comply with Build America, Buy America. So if you are the general contractor on the construction project, you're going to have to comply with Build America, Buy America. If you are the supplier who's just providing some of those materials, you're going to have to comply with Build America, Buy America. So it's important if you're lower down in the supply chain, particularly when it might not be as abundantly clear to you what kind of project we're talking about or whether we're even talking about a federal grant or a federal contract. It's really important to make sure that you're asking the right questions to understand which regime applies because most likely there is some sort of domestic sourcing requirement that is going to apply to you. And so it's important to make sure that you are getting it right.
Absolutely. You're not insulated from kind of the obligation of complying just because you're further down the chain. And I think to your point, Amy, too, it can be hard when you're just a supplier. You say, well, I don't know if this is a federal project. I just give them the pipes. Like right. that's not my job. So to Amy's point, always asking those questions is important.
Yeah. Okay. So I think what we've learned is BABA applies to grants, but BABA does not apply to all grants. Mm-hmm. And BABA's not going to apply to everything on the grant. And even when it does apply on the grant, it's going to apply in different ways depending on what product it actually is.
Yeah, no questions. That's easy. Yeah. There we go.
I think you got it.
Nothing else. Well, if you're in construction and infrastructure, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you have learned something from this.
And that's it for Claims and Sustains. Thanks.